This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being at our webinar today. My name is Marcia. I'm the webinar director here at Advice Chaser. Before we introduce our guests and get started, I do need to do a little bit of legal housekeeping. Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. We cannot and do not give financial advice. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only and cannot be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars, such as this one, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, jokes, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true, funny, or interesting, are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information you hear today without consulting a qualified financial professional. Well, we are thrilled to bring you this educational presentation. Attendees are muted, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the chat box. The presenters will answer those queries during or after the presentation today as appropriate. If you ask a question in the chat box, go ahead and leave your phone number and email address as well. If we can't get to your question during this event, we'll make sure someone reaches out to you to address that after today's event. Well, we want this experience to be as educational as possible, so please don't hesitate to ask for clarification or expansion of the material. I'd love to introduce you to today's guests. Carl R. Hall, CFA, is a co-founder and chief investment officer of Lodestar Wealth. He started his investment management career in 1998. His experience spans portfolio management, global asset allocation, and equity analysis. Carl is also co-founder of Healthy Hive, HiveAway LLC, a financial technology company at the intersection of health and wealth. Healthy Hive provides digital education and consulting services to self-funded health plans and retirement plan fiduciaries. He is passionate about data science and its important role in influencing the convergence of the healthcare and financial services industries. Carl is a graduate of Bowdoin College and Babson College. James J. Tavares, AIF, is a co-founder of Lodestar Wealth, an investment fiduciary specializing in retirement planning for business owners and their employees. Lodestar Wealth is a public benefit corporation, meaning it aims to provide a positive impact on society in addition to turning a profit. James majored in business economics at Brown University. James began his investment management career in 2006. His professional focus is on retirement plan consulting and individual wealth management. Before moving into financial services, he was enrolled in the PLME program at Brown University's Warren Alpert School of Medicine. He is an ardent believer in outcome-based consulting, tailoring his recommendations to the goals of his clients, supported with data-driven insights. We're very excited to have both of these speakers here today, and I'm so excited to turn the time over to you. I believe we're going to start with you, James, and I'm going to turn the time over to you now.
Yes, thank you, Marcia. We're very excited to be a part of Advice Chaser's excellent series of educational webinars. I am glad that you do not endorse jokes, because my jokes tend to be cheesy and dad jokes these days. So thank you for that. We are especially excited to be talking about today's topic, investment HSAs, and how they can be used to augment your financial plan. This is a subject that is near and dear to both Carl and I. I spent some time in medicine. Carl, as you mentioned earlier, founded Healthy Hive, which is at the intersection of health and wealth. So this is an important topic. We actually utilize a mantra at Lodestar Wealth that we'd like to provide our clients with financial health. And that's a term that we feel has dual meaning. Obviously, it means the health of your finances, but it also means the impact of healthcare on finances. And as we'll see in the future slides, if not properly planned for, Rising costs of healthcare can derail even the best financial plan. Most people aren't even aware that you can invest your HSA like a 401k or an IRA. And because of the triple tax advantage nature of an HSA, it actually should be a superior investment to 401ks and IRAs when covering retirement plans. So we'll get into that in just a few minutes. So if we could transition to the agenda. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to start with an overview of what goals-based investing actually is and how to build a goals-based plan. Doesn't make any sense to talk about incorporating an HSA into a plan if you don't know what goals-based is. From there, Carl is going to give you an HSA crash course. And then finally, we'll tie it all together into why HSAs are a perfect fit into your goals-based plan. As Marche mentioned at the beginning, we're happy to take questions over the course of the presentation. Otherwise, it's just the three of us talking at the audience for an hour, but we will leave time at the end for questions as well. So what is goals-based investing? Really, goals-based investing is an updated view on the portfolio construction and planning process, as well as an updated view on risk. So the conventional way of building portfolios was based off of modern portfolio theory. And Harry Markowitz introduced modern portfolio theory to the world in a paper in 1952. He ultimately won the Nobel Prize in economics for that paper. I think at this point, you can argue that modern portfolio theory is no longer modern. So there's my first cheesy dad joke. And the framework was really focused on maximizing returns for a given level of risk. And this is the genesis of that balanced portfolio that many of you are probably familiar with. Well, the world's changed a lot since 1952, particularly around retirement planning. Now, in those days when Harry wrote the paper, Modern Portfolio Theory, retirement planning was done via pensions, right, or Social Security. So it was an institutional focus on how to build a portfolio. The introduction of 401ks and IRAs has really put the onus of saving on the individual rather than an institution, and that requires a different approach. That approach is much more pragmatic and less academic than what we saw with the original Modern Portfolio Theory. And more importantly, it changes your view of risk. So risk is no longer defined as market volatility, which Harry was solving for, but singularly, it's the probability of not hitting your goals. That's the only risk you really have in investing. So how you then construct a portfolio, both in terms of your asset allocation and your asset location, are optimized to give you the highest chance of hitting your goals. It's goals-based investing in a nutshell. And let's take a look at an example of what that looks like in the context of retirement planning.
Okay, before you go on to this, I did have a question here. When you
Sure.
talk about the risk is that you won't hit your goals, I'm assuming you're going to go into that. And so they're asking for an example. So I don't know if we want to go on to the next part or if you want to give an example here.
I can give an example here and then we'll cover it along the way as well. So
right.
When we generally talk risk in markets, and Carl, feel free to add anything as we go through this explanation. Generally speaking, risk in investing is a quantifiable term. It's your standard deviation, right? It's the volatility that you'll see in your portfolio. So oftentimes in a modern portfolio theory world, when we talk about managing for risk, what we're trying to do is maximize return for whatever given level of standard deviation or volatility the client's willing to accept. And that's fine. That's a great starting point. And we're actually building on that in a goals-based framework. But it doesn't really capture the true problem, which is, am I going to have enough money for retirement? So if you want an example of what risk is in a goals-based world, is will I have enough by the time I retire to not run out of money? Volatility will impact that. Inflation will impact that. But that risk of running out of money supersedes everything else. So when we talk about risk, what we're trying to do is quantify what are the chances of you having enough money up until and then through retirement.
Thank you. Thank you for that example.
Sure. So in the context, if we could move on, Marche, of what that looks like, I'm sorry. The chart that you see on the screen here is courtesy of JP Morgan's annual guide to retirement. And this really helps to explain what we mean when planning for retirement. What you'll see here is a number of categories that comprise the spending for both working adults and retirees as a percentage of their overall budget. The chart also shows what the average annual inflation rate is for each spending category. And hopefully you can all see it on the screen, you should be able to note that housing, healthcare, and food cover about 3/4 of all spending for retirees. It's also important to note that healthcare it doubles actually, from 7% of your spending in your working years to 14% of your overall budget by the time you retire.
Okay,
So
so
this
what
is,
we're sorry,
yes,
so what we're seeing here is like the gray bar is working years and the green bar is retirement years,
correct. Yep, the gray bar is what your budget looks like in your working years, and then you see that jump in healthcare, which is the second set of bars, going from 7% of your budget in your working years to 14% in your retirement years. And that's due to the rising cost of healthcare, the inflation with healthcare. Prior to 2021, which is a bit of an anomaly year, healthcare had by far the highest inflation rate. It was actually double overall inflation. So we all know healthcare is getting more and more expensive. So wouldn't it make sense, and this is what we talk about in a goals-based context, to have a specific plan for covering just your healthcare costs in retirement? And in that goals-based framework, what we're talking about is dedicating specific assets, hopefully in a tax-advantaged account, and that's the HSA, and then invest it in a manner that's going to help you tackle that problem head on.
I have another question here. Can you talk
Please.
a little bit about the these blue bars at the bottom? Is that salient to what we need to talk about today?
Yes, so the blue bars at the bottom, and thank you for that clarification. The blue bars show the average annual inflation rate by spending category. So the whole point of that is you're going to spend most of your money in retirement on housing, healthcare, food, and then transportation. On average, healthcare costs rise faster than all of those other categories. So if you're thinking about retirement as a long-term problem, you're going to, and Carl's going to address this in some future slides, you're going to spend more money on healthcare in the future than you are today. So you need to plan for that increasing cost within a goals-based context. Great clarification. So when we also talk about breaking away from modern portfolio theory in a goals-based world, we're also talking about breaking away from style box investing. Now, style box have been the building blocks of a diversified portfolio going back to Harry's paper in 1952. Goals-based de-emphasizes the importance of style boxes. It doesn't mean that we ignore them altogether, and certainly we pay heed to the benefits of diversification. What we're focusing on in a goals-based framework is more of an active, factor-driven investment framework. So it's another way of saying we're not just going to, in goals-based investing, put 20% in large cap, 20% in mid cap, 20% in bonds or international, keep our fingers crossed and hope that that diversification gets us there. Really, you should be thinking about two things in a goals-based investing framework: is how do I adjust my portfolio as I get closer to funding my goal? So not just staying with that balanced portfolio over time. And more importantly, how do I minimize tail risk? So the probability that a big black swan event like a 2008 derails me on my path to hitting my goals. So if you think about 2008 as an example, if your portfolio lost 20, 30, or 40%, it takes time to recover from there. And if your plan was to retire in a few years at age 65, well, guess what? That's not happening, right? And so in a goals-based framework, you really want to put an emphasis on trying to minimize those events. So once you've built the framework for how to select investments, which is what we're talking about here, the next step is to put it all together in a tailored portfolio. And goals-based investing really requires you as an individual or your advisor or consultant to have a complete financial picture. And really what that means is having an understanding of your goals, your wishes, your wants, and other important factors like your time horizon, your current funding level towards your goals, and also your contribution rates. So when you think about this or compare it to one of the more in vogue investments of the day, target date funds, goals-based is really a much more complete or robust way of investing a portfolio. So target date funds really only look at one factor, and that's a person's age. But not all 55-year-olds are created equally, right? So it doesn't matter if we're both 55 and planning on retiring at 65 if I don't know how much you've already saved towards your goals, how much you're planning on saving going forward, if you have a spouse or a partner that has additional assets. So it's really difficult to argue that target dates are truly goals-based investing. What you also have to do from a goals-based perspective is adjust your portfolio over time as either you get closer to funding your goal or your goals change. So it really requires an understanding of where the individual is and where they want to go and all of the inputs associated with that. So that's how you build it. And then the next step is to implement some technology, or you can do it the old-fashioned way, but other means to audit your progress. Now, as a firm, we like to utilize sophisticated planning software to provide our clients with some clarity as to how their plan is working. But you can use an old-fashioned spreadsheet or an abacus even, if you know how to work those things, to track your progress. But the important thing is you do need to track your progress. Otherwise, it's difficult to make adjustments. A popular way to track your progress towards your goal is by using Monte Carlo simulations. Those are just algorithms that predict the probability of an event occurring, like saving for and spending through retirement, right? That's a pretty important event. And they do so when there's numerous outcomes or variables that are possible or present. With these probabilities, we can determine if the goals-based plan is working and then what adjustments need to be made. So what you see here is a Monte Carlo simulation that's predicting a 74% chance of attaining your goal. From there, you can inform the client or the individual as to whether or not changes need to be made, so as giving them a higher probability of meeting their goal. And these probabilities are all a series of trade-offs, right? So as you're saving for retirement along the way, you're thinking about major purchases that may come up. And if you tap into some of your retirement funds to pay for those purchases, it'll have an impact on this. So when you put this all together, what goals-based investing is, it's a new framework for thinking about your portfolio. It really starts with putting the client at the center of the planning process, and then thinking of risk solely in that context of failing to achieve your goals. Your portfolio is then constructed to give you the highest probability of achieving those goals. And then you use technology or spreadsheets to track your progress along the way and make adjustments. So that's the crux of goals-based investing. And I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Carl, to discuss, to provide a crash course on HSAs.
Great. Thanks, James. Appreciate that. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Carl Hall, co-founder of Lodestar Wealth. And if you're on this call, you probably have a general idea as to what an HSA is, but we'll just right here is from Bill Stewart, who the author of HSAs, the Tax Perfect Retirement Account, is a more refined definition of an HSA. And by the way, if you're really into taxes and HSAs, Bill Stewart is basically the advisor's advisor. So whenever we have a really technical question about any HSA related inquiry, we generally harass Bill. I think high level, the HSA, things to keep in mind is it's personally owned. It's in someone's individual name. It's triple tax. There's a triple tax benefit to HSAs. And the primary criterion for determining whether or not you can fund an HSA is you have to be enrolled in a qualified high deductible health plan. So that's really the most important aspect of an HSA. And there are actually a lot of tens of thousands of Americans out there who are actually enrolled in qualified high deductible health plans and who may not even be aware of the fact that funding an HSA is an option for them. So that HDHP aspect is the most important in terms of high level defining what an HSA is. And thanks, Marcia. So just as important of talking about the intricacies of an HSA and from a definitional perspective, I think it's really important to start with what an HSA is not. And this is really important. And I think this actually helps clarify a lot of the alphabet soup confusion around employee benefits and retirement planning. An HSA is not an FSA. And if you take away anything from this call, please take that away. It's really critical because a lot of people who own HSAs, even today, even though HSAs have been around for almost 20 years, a lot of people still to this day think that they have to spend down their HSA balance in December of every year, and that's just not the case. An HSA, if you look at the term "what's in a name," look at FSA. Most people think of an FSA as flexible spending account. The actual definition of an FSA is flexible spending arrangement, and I bring that up because that arrangement is actually an arrangement between an employer and the employees, and it's more of an insurance related type of offering, whereas an HSA is more of a financial account option. So it's flexible spending arrangement versus health savings account. And we always like to joke that just if you have an HSA, just do not be spending your money on 30 SPF sunscreen in December. You want to do that from your FSA. And one quick note, you can have both an FSA and an HSA. It's just that the FSA has to be a special purpose FSA, which is basically a specially designed FSA intended for dental and vision. So that's another small little detail there. So HSA and FSA are not the same thing. Really quick infographic here that covers contribution limits, deductibles, and out-of-pocket maximums. So in 2022, if it's an individual plan HSA, you can put up to $3,650 into that account, and then $7,300 for a family plan. So I mean, it's not, while the amounts are not the same or as high as a 401k max out, it's still not nothing. I mean, I think especially if you start early in your career, and if you start to get off to an early start and chip away at that balance over time, and if you do invest in it, obviously will add up over the years. Minimum deductibles, and by the way, the minimum deductible is set by the IRS every year. So for an individual plan, in order for it to be considered a qualified high deductible account, it has to have a $1,400 minimum deductible for individual accounts, or a $2,800 for a family plan. And just a note of caution that is the IRS mandated minimum. Your personal plan may actually have a higher deductible. Out-of-pocket maximum. So this is another important aspect to look at. It is, in some cases, the out-of-pocket maximum can get hit if you have a really high healthcare expenditure in any given calendar year. And that generally comes in the form of a high coinsurance. So, maybe you break a leg, or you have to get a couple of expensive MRIs or CAT scans. You can easily blow through your deductible, but then you could also be hit with out-of-pocket maximum exposure. So I think it's important to note that an HSA is not necessarily for everyone. There is some financial risk, and especially depending on your income level. And just know that the out-of-pocket max for a family plan in 2022 is $14,100. Usually people do not hit that, but if you have a pre-existing condition and if you're expected to spend a lot out of pocket, an HSA may actually not even be the best option for you. Looks like we got another question here, Marcia.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and ask this because it applies directly to what we're talking about. So the question is, are all plans with high deductibles, I think high deductible plans with eligibility for HSAs? I think that's what they meant, even though not shown as a HSA type policy in the name. So that's a good question.
It's a great question. And you always need to, usually the plan name itself, a health plan name itself will include HSA. I shouldn't say usually. In some cases, it'll actually have HSA in the name itself, but it's always smart to check with if it's a workplace plan, always check with the employee benefit office, because that's actually a question that comes up more often than you would think it would. But you always want to be sure you double check and just ensure that it is actually a qualified high deductible plan with the benefit person. Now, if you're going to an insurance exchange, if it's an individual account through an exchange, They usually have HSA in the name, and it's usually pretty straightforward, but it's always smart to double check just to make sure that that is indeed a qualified high deductible plan. Good question.
All right. Do we need to move on to the next part?
And I guess we can go on to the next slide unless there are any other questions here.
Great.
So there was a great question around, what's an example of a goals-based plan? And I think this is actually, oh yes, someone to explain the $1,000 additional catch-up contribution. Okay, so if you're 55 or older, there's another question that came in. If you're 55 or older, this is another great question. You can actually contribute to an incremental $1,000 to your HSA. And obviously, if you're 55, you're not 25 and you're closer to retirement. So that's certainly something that if you can afford to do, it's certainly something you want to take advantage of. Great questions coming in fast and furious. I love it. Cost of retirement, so every year there's a study that comes out that quantifies on average, and that's on average, and you can drive a truck between the high and the low estimate of that. But I think it's even over $300,000 for a married couple at the age of 65. You're going to need over $300,000. Well, I shouldn't say you're going to need $300,000 is the dollar amount that is projected you're going to spend in retirement. And sometimes I cringe when I see this dollar amount because I'd say 99.96% of HSA owners do not have a balance of $300,000. So do not let that discourage you. I almost wonder if it's for the shock factor. If you have a $300,000 HSA, great, you're well done. You don't need to hear my presentation and James's insights around this, but most people don't have that saved up, even when they reach the age of 65. But I think the really important thing here to note is kind of dismal numbers here on this slide that kind of just cover the lack of preparation in the retirement savings deficit. But the most important thing from our perspective is start early. All right. What I mean by that is that we've poured over a lot of data. We could really bore you with some numbers around healthcare spending by age and gender as an example. And we refer to certain cohorts as the young invincibles. So if you're 24, 23, 19, 18, whatever, you're just entering the workforce and you have the opportunity to start to fund an HSA, consider doing it early, especially because in some cases it may actually make sense to enroll in a qualified high deductible plan during your single years when you're young and you're not likely to go to the doctors. Now, of course, you may break an ankle or something like that. There's always that risk, but in some cases, it may actually make sense to really be very aggressive in your young years to fund an HSA and also invest it if that's something we'll talk about that in a minute. But start funding that early and often. And, you might even be in a situation where family formation years start to come down the pike and, you want to have kids and you're certainly expected to face higher out-of-pocket expenses. In some cases, maybe it makes sense to actually pivot back to that lower deductible plan. And then once the childbearing years are sunsetted, you can kind of move back to that HSA option as well. So there's actually a timing element to this as well. So start early, and $300,000 is the number, but don't let that discourage you from looking at an HSA option. So if we look at the HSAs to the rescue slide, so what this looks at really the tax benefit in the very immediate term and then the longer term potential. And on the left hand side where it's the tax savings analysis, you're supposing a scenario where someone's making $35,000 a year and they're expected to spend $1,500 on qualified medical expenses. And what this does is it just gives you the impact of funding an HSA pre-tax versus paying that $1,500 out of pocket on an after-tax basis. And in this situation, the near-term savings is $490. That's the immediate term. Now, on the right-hand side, you look at the hypothetical age breakdown and HSA value, assuming that you start with $3,600 at the age of 25, and then you're putting in $300 monthly into that HSA, and presumably you're investing the majority of that because it's an implied 5% growth rate. So it just shows you the future value opportunity of that HSA value. And if you examine the age 65 scenario with a future potential value of $486,000, what you would then want to do is you'd want to actually adjust that for the tax benefit, because that $486,000 at the age of 65, if you're spending that on a qualified medical expense, that's not going to be taxed. All right. So you compare that with a traditional IRA that is taxable. And if you assume a 25% average tax rate, that $486,000 HSA would actually have to be a $648,000 IRA, given that the tax burden that traditional IRA is going to face. So the tax benefits of HSAs really shine when you walk through these scenarios. And this is obviously a case where you got someone who's funding this over time and they're investing, their HSA, and it's pretty extraordinary at the end of the day. I mean, you're talking about a $162,000 future value tax savings. So again, the real value is to start early, and I can't emphasize that enough, because I think it was Einstein that said it was something about compound interest being the eighth wonder of the world. And if you do start early, and if you're consistent about funding that HSA, you can certainly start to grow that nest egg over time. However, that being said, if you are spending out of your HSA, just know that there are some immediate tax benefits as well, which is the left-hand scenario.
We do have several questions that have come in, and I do want to address some of these really quickly. So
Sure.
we talked about IRAs. Someone's not familiar exactly with that term. If you can explain just a little bit about, give some examples of how an HSA differs from, say, a 401k that you would get at work, and then we'll address some of these other questions.
So yeah, sure. IRA, individual retirement account, and there's a couple different versions of an IRA. You can have a Roth IRA where you're actually funding that with after-tax monies, and upon distribution, it's not taxable. Traditional IRA is when you do go to take money out of the IRA, it's taxable. It's a taxable event. And relative to a 401k, now keep in mind that it's actually an important distinction here. A 401k is actually an account that is part of a plan, usually an employee-sponsored plan. An HSA, again, it's an individually owned account, so it's a different beast relative to a 401k. And oh, by the way, an HSA is also portable. So if you have an HSA in a workplace setting and you decide to take on a new job, or you leave the job, you can take that HSA with you. And James, you want to shed any more light on that particular inquiry?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on all the salient points. At the end of the day, all of these accounts, whether it's a 401k, an IRA, or an HSA, are referred to as qualified accounts. So they qualify for special tax treatment from the government. They're created to incentivize savings and potentially investing to certain goals. So 401ks and IRAs are really targeted for overall retirement savings, while the HSA is specialized to help cover healthcare savings. The differences in the accounts, and Carl did a good job of hitting this, are how you fund them. So you can't fund a 401k unless your employer sponsors one, whereas an HSA or an IRA are individual accounts, and as long as you qualify, you can contribute to them. And then how they're treated from a tax standpoint. But at the end of the day, these are all levers that you pull to try and plan for and save for retirement.
All right, well, we're going to go ahead and move on. I know that some of the questions that were asked are going to be covered by our next section, so let's go ahead and move forward.
Great. So, and looking at just considering how to use your HSA, it's funny. When I look at the slide, I'm like, oh, well, yeah, save. Of course you want to save, but in some cases, like I mentioned at the top of the presentation, you may actually be enrolled in a qualified high deductible plan and not have an HSA, and not even realize that that's an option. So number one is if you have a qualified plan, is just to save right into it. All right. And that traditionally goes just right into basically a banking account where, well, I guess interest rates are rising. So hopefully you get a little bit of return in the form of interest on that balance, but it's not likely to fund your future retirement needs. So it's to save into that account. And again, that's the tax benefit that we went over is, if you need to spend it, you get that tax shield, right out of the gate, as opposed to spending that $1,500 hypothetical on qualified medical expenses. By virtue of saving into that HSA, you're able to then spend that $1,500 on qualified expenses. Whereas if you don't fund that HSA and you spend that $1,500 with after-tax money, that's money that was taxed on the way in. And then the middle part there is the invest, and we'll get into that when we talk about the 4 profiles of HSA users. But these are basically the 3 primary ways to use the HSA. The other one I would just really quick, a little pro tip, and this is maybe a little too technical, but in
That's
some
okay.
cases,
I'll check you if it gets too technical, and we'll explain
well,
things.
and I love this just because it's one of those, whether it's the water cooler, you're talking about these little pro tips around HSAs, they call it the shoeboxing approach. So what I mean by that is, let's assume that you wanted to save into your HSA and you wanted to invest that entire contribution. Let's say that maybe you have a pretty good income and you're comfortable, you have plenty of disposable assets at your fingertips. Shoeboxing refers to you're funding that HSA, either you're just keeping that in the bank account or you're investing it. And to the extent that you're facing out-of-pocket healthcare expenditures, you're paying with after-tax money, either on a debit card or credit card or whatever. If you hold on to those receipts that you spend money on, you can actually reimburse yourself in the next day or 20 years down the road, the way that the HSA rules work. So we call that the shoeboxing approach. And I actually have personally a shoebox that I keep medical receipts in. I probably shouldn't be admitting that on a webcast because it's really, but the idea there is, and what's cool about that is it actually, if you take that approach, you're creating a stealth emergency savings account as well. So let's assume that you have a $10,000 HSA balance, and you also have $5,000 in healthcare expense receipts over the last 10 years. If need be, you can actually access that HSA and you can withdraw that $5,000 tax-free, so long as you have proof of having spent that money on qualified medical expenses. So it's one of those you tell someone who's got an HSA and they're like, well, really? That's kind of shocking. But anyway, that's the shoebox approach. And I digress. So we'll continue. Any more questions, Marcia, or you want to just keep going?
Let's keep going. I think some of these I'd like to save at the end once we've done some more explaining about how to contribute, and we'll move on.
Sure. So I think really quick on this slide, ways to contribute. You or your, ideally, if you have an employer-based HSA, it'd be great if your employer also chips in on that on an annualized basis. So but the vast majority of assets that flow into an HSA come from the employee themselves. The best way to fund an HSA is actually through payroll. And another little twist to HSAs is, relative to a 401k contribution, an HSA contribution avoids the FICA tax. All right. So that is, I think it's 7.65% Medicare and Social Security tax. So if you, when you fund a 401k, that's actually subject to the FICA tax, whereas an HSA is not. So right out of the gate, that HSA dollar is worth more than that 401k dollar, even before you consider the tax implications when you actually take the money out of an IRA. So the most efficient way to fund an IRA is really through payroll. Direct contributions is, let's say it's not a workplace plan. If you're funding that HSA with after-tax dollars, that's a great option as well, because you have an above-the-line tax deduction that is really powerful, especially to those who are making a lot of money and are looking for tax deductions. Just a quick point of clarification, we are not tax professionals, so definitely consult your tax professional about that. So in a nutshell, to kind of summarize here, we talked about Bill Stewart's more technical definition. I'm a big baseball guy, and I like this, so I'm going to stick with it. HSAs are the knuckleball of the retirement planning repertoire, and knuckleball. I'm a Boston guy, so Tim Wakefield is a former knuckleball pitcher for the Red Sox, and he actually had to have a special catcher, Doug Mirabelli, catch him. And I make that analogy because we think that having a specialized catcher is actually relevant in the sense that an HSA kind of requires a specialized form of education and information, because it's in some cases it's neither fish nor fowl, or at least that's the way it's perceived. Is it an FSA? Is it the same thing? And is it a retirement account? So on and so forth. So that's my quote on HSAs, and I'm sticking with it, Marche. And I think we can move on from there.
All right. So we're going to talk about HSAs and goals-based planning. Now put the two together, and I believe we'll turn the time over to James here.
The mute button got me. The phrase of 2020 and 2021, you're on mute. You would think by now we would have been able to avoid that. No, that was a great overview on HSAs from Carl. You can see the passion that he has for HSAs and how to utilize them in a planning process. And before we can start implementing HSAs in a planning process, you sort of have to understand what type of HSA user you are. So we came up with this framework with the help of Bill Stewart, the godfather of HSAs, to really identify 4 types of HSA users: the spender, the saver, the dabbler, and the planner. So we'll spend a couple minutes going over each of the user types and then how that would impact your financial plan. But before you go over the user types, you sort of need to understand what considerations you should think about before self-identifying as one of these user types. And really, we look at 5, any number of considerations, but 5 key ones that will help you determine which user type you are. First and foremost is, are you reaching your annual deductible? From there, are you currently contributing to those other qualified accounts that we talked about, your 401k, your IRA, how much, and whether or not there's matches associated with your 401k? That'll sort of help inform your HSA user type. Are you a dependent dealing with a chronic medical condition that requires you to frequently spend on healthcare? That'll have an important factor in which type of user you are. Is your family expecting? Carl mentioned this, that there's an annual enrollment for your healthcare plan. So you can pivot back and forth between a high deductible and a non-high deductible plan. If you're anticipating as a young individual that you're going to be having a baby soon or starting some family planning, it might be a good time to transition to the non-high deductible plan and take advantage of that increased spending that you'll have there. And then the last consideration, and this is critically important, can you cover your healthcare expenses without using your HSA? And as we talk about the user types, we'll talk about possibly investing your HSA. We always recommend keeping enough liquid and safe investments to cover your deductible. But if you're the type of person that couldn't cover your healthcare expenses without using your HSA, you certainly don't want to start investing it. So looking more closely at the user types, the first is the spender. So the HSA spender is an individual who's basically treating their HSA like a checking account, right? So if you're that person that has a chronic medical condition, you're going to be a spender. If you're moving towards having a family and growing your family, you're typically going to be a spender. Certainly, if you couldn't pay for your out-of-pocket healthcare costs without tapping into your HSA, you're a spender. So spenders benefit from having an HSA because of the lower monthly premiums that they pay, and then the tax-free HSA distributions to cover your out-of-pocket expenses. It's essentially going into the account and coming right out to cover those, but in doing so, you're getting that tax advantage, or you're benefiting from that triple tax advantage nature of an HSA. From an investment standpoint, don't invest if you're a spender, right? So that just stays in your money market option.
Great, and thanks, James. So this second profile, the saver profile, is someone who may or may not be high income earner, but they're healthy and they're looking for that tax savings to cover future healthcare costs. And obviously, the short-term benefit is funding that HSA for future healthcare expenditures. For the saver, it's also likely that he or she will be interested in actually investing all or a portion of that HSA contribution, given the longer-term time horizon, number one, and number two, I think more importantly, that they're not expected to face high out-of-pocket healthcare costs. So that's the saver profile. The investment strategy may be growth for him or her. Again, they are healthy. There may be a young invincible. So you could have a young invincible who's lower income, yet to James's point, you're taking advantage of the lower premium for that healthcare plan, and you have a very long time horizon. So he or she may decide to start investing all or a portion of that contribution. The dabbler, that's this is kind of someone right in the middle there. They're on the fence. They're expected to have some out-of-pocket exposure, and they're wrapping their head around just how awesome HSAs are, and you know, they're kind of like taking kind of a middle path, I guess is what you would say, which I think is a smart thing to always do. And you know, you're probably going to save all or a majority of that funding up to over the first couple of years. And you know, maybe after you build up that nest egg in that banking account, or that the core HSA deposit account, you decide you actually want to start to deploy some of those balances into riskier investments. So investment strategy of safety and growth, I think that really refers to is early on, let's just build that core balance of that HSA up. And then down the road, maybe you get a new job, maybe you get a raise, and you decide you're going to start to deploy some of that towards investments. And one quick note here: always be sure to have enough of a balance in your HSA to cover an entire year's at least annual deductible, just to be conservative. Last thing you want to do is start funding it, especially if you're a spender. You know, to James's point, you don't want to be funding an HSA and then investing it, and then all of a sudden realize you're looking at $6,000 or $7,000 in out-of-pocket healthcare expenditures, especially in a market environment like we are in right now, where you know, it's pretty volatile. And it's amazing. In 2022, people realize, oh yeah, you can actually lose money in investing. So I forgot about that. In the last 2 years since the pandemic, it was just you know, it was a different story. But you know, investing can be risky. Thanks, Marche.
And the last user type is the planner. So the planner is generally an individual that has relatively high income, high earner, limited need for out-of-pocket help on their expenditures. So even if they are spending frequently on healthcare, it's not important to them to have to tap into their HSA. These are individuals that tend to be really financially savvy and are looking to maximize their current tax savings while incorporating their HSA into the overall planning process. And that's that shoeboxing that we discussed. I think a question came into the chat from Grant that said something along the lines of, so basically save into your HSA, don't use it until you need to for medical expenses down the road. Grant is HSA, you know, he's a 200 master's course HSA level attendee, because that's essentially it, right? That's the crux of it. If you're working on a financial plan, that's what you should be thinking about. And then that's where the shoeboxing comes in, where you can then take assets out of your HSA and use them against medical expenses that you've paid all along the way. Really isn't, you know, a planner, you're going to benefit from those tax advantage contributions and that tax advantage growth. If you were to have any growth in your portfolio, you really want to focus on a growth strategy. So these are the individuals that will have that 1 year's deductible in a liquid account, and then the rest of it invested towards longer term growth.
Okay, so slide you're looking at here is there's a lot of, this is just basically an app that you can populate based on, and you can basically enter your assumptions. You start with $5,000 and you're putting in $300 per month, and you have a time horizon of 14 years. And what this app in particular does is it estimates in units of time the tax benefit. And what I mean by that is that 2.7 you see in the lower left based on these assumptions on this slide translates to that tax benefit in that HSA is going to afford you an incremental 2.7 years of healthcare spending down the road. And that's certainly based on an assumption as well that the estimated annual healthcare spending once you reach that time horizon at the end of that 14 years is, in this case, $13,420. But it's an interesting app because any kind of tax benefit is obviously, it's not tangible. You can't see or you can't touch it. But you know, you look at it from the perspective of being able to actually afford an extra 2.5 years of healthcare spending. What that really essentially equates to is it pulls forward your time to retirement, right? So if it's 14% of your budgeted expenditures, that 2.7 years is, you know, it's worth looking at, right? I mean, it's real. That tax benefit is real, I guess, is what I would say.
Yeah, and you can see that example that Carl mentioned in terms of pulling forward your ability to retire when you compare possible HSA balances at the year end for the different user types. So this is again from Bill Stewart's book on HSAs, and it shows you the balance at the end of the year, looking 5, 10, 15, and 20 years out for those different HSA user types. So a spender, obviously the money's coming in and going right out. They're not going to have any balance at the end of the year. They're using the HSA for the tax advantages to help them cover their costs of healthcare currently. The dabbler is doing a little bit of both. They're saving and they're spending along the way. Really where you see the impact from a planning perspective is in the saver and the planner scenarios. And so what we're assuming here is a 6% growth rate on top of your HSA contributions annually. And so those savers and planners are receiving that delayed gratification of having larger asset bases potentially when their retirement costs become incrementally higher over time. So that's really, you know, where you start matching that HSA investment process with the future costs of healthcare in retirement. Obviously, everybody's situation is unique. So it's, you know, when you're doing any sort of plan, it's important to understand your own situation and applying a strategy that works to your situation. But it's also important to note that things can change over time. So just because you may be a spender or a dabbler today does not mean you can't be a saver or a planner in the future. And as we begin to land the plane and opening it up for some additional questions, and again, Marche, we're very appreciative of you having us on for this presentation. When you put it all together, goals-based investing starts with the concept that your accounts and your assets should be assigned directly to a specific goal. For most individuals, that's obviously saving for and spending through retirement. A big part of spending through retirement is covering healthcare costs. Your asset allocation should then be tied to your goal attainment. How risky you are is really a function of how well funded you are. And then lastly, in a goals-based framework, you want to use some sort of software to track and audit your progress along the way. What's exciting about HSAs, why they're that really cool knuckleball approach that Carl mentioned, is that they solve for a very specific but very important problem in retirement. So when we say that the HSA is the secret to a goals-based plan, it's because of what we just showed you in those previous slides, that triple tax advantage nature of an HSA. So hopefully everyone found this informative. That was a lot of information in a relatively short period of time. But again, thank you for having us. And Marche, if there's some additional questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
All right. Well, we're almost at the end of our time, but if you don't mind, I don't mind running a couple minutes over to go ahead and address these questions.
Sure.
And again, what I will say to our attendees, I know that this is maybe you're taking time off work and you need to maybe get back to work. you will get a recording of the replay of this event. So let's go ahead and jump into some of these questions. So can HSA funds be used to buy long-term care insurance?
Yes.
All right.
Premiums, Medicare premiums are considered medical expenses, and you can use those for, they qualify as expenses.
So Medicare premiums and also long-term care insurance premiums.
Correct.
Okay.
Really quick, just to interject here, Medigap, it's tricky. Like, so Medicare Advantage, you can do that. You can use HSA funds for Medicare Advantage, but Medigap, you cannot use HSA funds for. So if it's a supplemental plan like Medigap, you can't. So and that's, you know, that's next level type of detail, but just keep that in mind. So you can, in some cases, you can use the HSA funds towards an insurance product, but if it's a supplemental plan like Medigap, you cannot use HSA funds for that.
All right, that's a good clarification here. So you can use it. So if you're not on Medicare and you're just doing a regular health care insurance premium, can you also use SHA funds for that?
Not for traditional health insurance premiums, no.
Okay, all right. This is a good question about the shoeboxing approach. Do the shoebox receipts have to be from the time period when you were enrolled in an HSA?
Great question. No, as long as you were enrolled at the time when you funded that HSA, when you purchased that healthcare service, as long as you were enrolled in a qualified high deductible plan, no. So that's the beauty of it. So you may spend 10 years at a job and fund the heck out of an HSA, and then for whatever reason you're no longer enrolled in that high deductible plan, but you can, if you have receipts, you can always reimburse yourself for that.
Yeah. And I think just to add to that, if you had a large healthcare expenditure that you paid for prior to being in an HSA, you could not shoebox that piece. So to Carl's point, if you're out of the HSA, you can pull away from it. But if you had a huge healthcare expenditure in 2022, but didn't enroll in an HSA till 2023, that 2022 shoebox receipt would not qualify.
All right, thank you for that clarification. Can you go over really quickly what you mean by that triple tax benefit? I'm sure people know, but I want to make sure we cover it in here.
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, so it goes in tax-free, it grows tax-free, and it comes out tax-free. And really, that gets back to that payroll scenario where if you're funding an HSA through a payroll, it really does go in tax-free as opposed to that FICA exposure for the 401k. So there's no tax on the way in. To the extent that you're investing those HSA balances while it's in the HSA, it grows tax-free, meaning that you're not going to pay, you're not going to have any type of capital gain exposure to any either individual equities or securities or ETFs or mutual funds. So in that sense, it's great for an asset class like high yield that on an after-tax basis may not be that attractive. So it grows tax-free. And then on the way out the door, as long as you're spending those balances on qualified healthcare expenses, it comes out tax-free. So, it's really the only, that we know of, the only triple tax exempt retirement savings vehicle available to Americans today. And really quick, if you're going to be spending on your HSA, because I don't think we really hit on this, be sure to try to use transparency tools. So instead of spending $3,000 on an MRI, if you spend only $1,000, which by the way happens all the time, the dispersion healthcare cost is enormous. So use transparency tools to the extent that you're a spender, because down the road, that's going to drive more savings, and that's going to increase the probability or the potential of investing at some point.
All right. Here's another good question. Do you have to spend the money from your HSA on your own medical expenses, or can it be for a family member? And can you talk a little bit about that?
James, you want to take that?
Yes. So individuals, you can use your HSA expenditures for your other family members as well. You'd be able to pay for their medical costs.
Even if if those other family members were not enrolled in an HSA?
Correct.
Okay. I have a couple more questions, and then we're going to go ahead and end. After retirement, can an HSA be used for purposes other than healthcare expenses?
So yeah, at the age of 65, before you turn 65, if you take out distribution from your HSA and it's not a qualified expense, it's taxable income, number one. Then number two, you get a 20% penalty on that, right? So, but after at age 65, if you take a distribution from your HSA, it is it's going to be taxable, but you're not going to be facing that 20% penalty tax. So in that sense, it acts just like a traditional IRA. That's a great question.
Yes, very good question here.
Yeah, we love that aspect of it from a planning perspective. So when we talk about the HSA carrying superiority over your 401k and your IRA, when you think about contributions, that's the beauty of it, right? Is that if you put money in your HSA, it's going to help you cover healthcare costs down the road. And should we ever get to a situation, fingers crossed, where healthcare gets cheaper, right? Then your HSA can be utilized like an IRA.
All right. Well, we had one more question about Medicare, but I think we already covered that. So I'm going to save these questions here. And if I need to reach out to this individual, I will after the fact. So let me save that really quickly. Folks, thank you so much for being here. I want to thank James and Carl for being willing to take all our questions and dive into a very, I think, not understood topic. So thank you for educating us, and I'm sure there's more. We'll probably talk about this for another couple webinars, but we do need to end. So again, thanks to the organizations that have worked with us to bring in this webinar today. Look for that replay in your inbox, in your email to our attendees, and you're welcome to share that with friends and family. Here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who's a great fit for your life and your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and every one of our advisor partners has committed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. Find out more by going to advicechaser.com and clicking on the link to find an advisor. Well, once again, from Advice Chaser, thank you so much for coming. Thanks to our attendees. We did get some thank yous in the chat. So Carl and James, thanks again. And we'll see everyone at another webinar soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, Marcia.
Thanks, Marcia.